Let's talk about a couple of some of the more memorable Emmy awards. So I'll mention them. Tell me if you have a story you'd like to share. But I know Julie said you had a great Powers Booth story. So can you talk about the 32nd Annual Emmy Awards in
That was my
1980?
first one.
Yes.
It was a year of SAG strike. At that stage of the game, you did not have SAG-AFTRA. You had SAG. And there was a SAG strike, which we went to SAG. I remember these meetings, and we said, look, we know what you're trying to do, and you're not hurting the networks, you're hurting the Academy. Don't do this. Well, sorry, we're going to do it. So we had two AFTRA members, Dick Clark and Steve Allen, who could do that because they weren't crossing the SAG picket line, and so they were our hosts that year. And one after another performer award was accepted by the Academy on behalf of the recipient.
So was there anyone in the audience?
So the audience was full, but it was full of executives and people who were okay to be there. So now we get toward the end of the show, and it's the award for lead actor in a miniseries or a special. The Jim Jones story, the horrible Guyana tragedy story. And the star of that, playing Jim Jones, was Powers Booth. And so the envelope is opened, and Powers Booth, and all of a sudden, here comes Powers Booth. Back from the lobby at the Pasadena Civic and down the aisle, and everybody was like, good Lord. And I think he said something, this could be a horrible mistake. But I really feel that this is something that, I should be here and I should get this award, and I appreciate it. Thank you, Academy, et cetera. And then he went off. Years later, his wife came. I think that at this stage of the game, he was ailing a bit. And his wife came, and she had the original Emmy, and it had fallen off shelf or got knocked over in an earthquake or something. And it was, torn up and whatever. So I fixed it for her. And I said, can you tell me what that day was like? What happened that day? How does... She said, he had gone to the laundromat. And he was this was the days when people actually went to laundromat. And, or the laundry, and he called me up and he said, I earned that nomination. It was a horrible part. I worked like crazy, and I just sort of think that this is not right, and it's not right for the Academy. It's not right for me, and I don't think that this is going to make a big difference to the Guild, and I frankly think that this is something that I should do. So he came to the Emmy Awards, and he got his Emmy Award.
And he was the only one of all 52
yes,
nominees, right?
He was the only one who actually appeared.
The next year, Hill Street Blues swept the Emmys, and they had not received critical. They had no audience. I mean, they were in danger of going off the air.
Yeah.
Talk about the impact the Emmys had for that show, and what's the legacy of that?
It was on the verge of being canceled, and it was critically acclaimed, but it just didn't have any numbers. And that night, it just took everything. I think this was 1984.
81.
81? Okay. But it did extraordinarily well. And all of a sudden, it came into the consciousness of the network that they really had something here. And so it was renewed, it got its audience, and I think it's very, very clear that the Emmy Awards saved Hill Street Blues, and not only Hill Street Blues, but also a new take on an old genre, the police procedural, which we really had kind of been stuck in the old days. And now all of a sudden, here's a very, very different take. It was gritty. It had an awful lot to do with, interpersonal relationships. Daniel J. Travanti's character was just constantly, I don't know why he didn't quit that job. It was a horrible job. Even his girlfriend yelled at him. And it was a new kind of show. And that show went on to, spawn any number of different kinds of shows. So it was a real contribution to American popular culture that the Emmys did what it did for the fate of Hill Street Blues.
Have you seen that as clear an example with other shows or people?
You know, that was such an extraordinary example. I'm sure that there have been other shows that perhaps were marginal and the network people saw that it got a boost. I think that it does happen. I think definitely in the era of subscriptions and the new business models, that if you have some Emmy traction, you definitely come to the notice, because one of the major changes in eligibility came from the HBO interest in getting into the Emmys. One reason I've already talked about, and that was our dear friend John Moffat, who said, I'm directing the same kind of show, and why am I not a part of it? But the other one came from a curious situation at the NCTA, the National Cable Television Association. This was a group in Washington that was basically a lobbying group, NCTA. And so they cooked up their own awards, which were called the ACE Awards. And then the American cinematography editors, they said, no, you can't have that. So they said, well, okay, we'll be the Cable ACE Awards. So they became the Cable ACE Awards. So it was a rather complex competition that you had to do all kinds of things with tape and put together these expensive and whatever entries. And year after year, for its relatively short history, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, HBO just clean house on everybody. And it was kind of getting to the point where you had, on the one hand, John Moffat saying, kick that door open for the Emmys. And on the other hand, the HBO people said, you know, this doesn't mean anything to us anymore. We are so dominant in the Cable ACE Awards that it's sort of like ho-hum, like, what have you got? And I think that this points out something about the Emmy Awards, that they really do mean something. Not only do they mean something within certain kinds of business plans and certain Machiavellian considerations, but they mean something emotionally for people. I have spent many a Sunday evening standing off stage as the people would come off with their Emmys. It used to be, when we started, before we got the more sophisticated band situation, is that we would only have the prop Emmy that was handed to the person on stage. They would come off, and then I would be there. Great job. I would be there saying, may I have this? We will be sending you your Emmy at a later time. And I remember this one guy came off. He was, I don't know, he was a craftsperson. He was at the Creative Arts. He said, oh my God. He said, no. He said, I'm going right now to the emergency room to be with my dying mother. And my dying mother said, honey, if you win the Emmy tonight, please come over and let me see it. I said, please, just go. Take the Emmy and go. I'm not going to argue with you on that. But people come off stage, and it's kind of like they are in a daze. It's like, they don't know where they are. They don't know what they have said. One of the reasons why we set up the thank you cam off stage is because people come back and they say, did I thank my man? Did I thank my husband? Don't worry about it. Here's the thank you cam. Say, calm down and say whatever you want to thank people, because people really are in an absolute stupor.
I can imagine people trying to just wrestle you for the thing if you're trying to take it from them off stage.
And you have to be very careful with this. There's a wonderful story about he's a writer, and he won an Emmy, and he's gesturing and whatever, and he goes back to his seat, and all of a sudden there's something funny about his shoe. His shoe is filling up with blood because he, bang, hit himself with a wing, lacerated his leg, and now it's bleeding down. When I see people standing up there on stage, there'll be a big crowd. Everybody's so excited, and the person holding the Emmy is going, and the person right behind them, do not put that person's eye out.
Didn't that happen to someone? Was it Kathy Griffin or someone actually almost poked their eye out?
Yeah,
it's sharp.
People, it is sharp. It definitely is sharp. Yeah, it's a situation in which you have to be very careful. Another one of my favorite stories is there was a sound editing crew. guy by the name of Russ Tinsley had a sound house, and his son Rusty had a prosthetic leg, and I said earlier that we would have a couple of the creative arts show up on a telecast. Well, sound editing one night was on the telecast. And so they were waiting for the category to come. So Rusty takes his leg off. Yeah. He's sitting there out in the audience or whatever, and he's got his, you won, okay. So everybody jumps up and they're running up. And Russ says, come on. I'm trying to get my leg back on. So he finally gets his leg. And we wait, and Russ wouldn't go up without his son. What a good dad. He wouldn't go up to the stage without his son until Rusty got his leg put back on, and so he came up. But that's how much it meant. It meant for him. He didn't want his son's experience to be diminished. He wanted it to be. There's in Eliot's Wasteland, there's a wonderful line where I came back late from the garden. My hair was wet, my arms were full. I could see nothing. I knew nothing. And that's the kind of stupor that you find these people in. They're just what happened. And I think that it's because it's a numinous experience. What other secular organization do you have in this town in which you have this goddess, this 30-foot or whatever, how big that statue is out there, of this goddess? I mean, it's a little pagan. It's a little bit strange if you start thinking about it, but she is numinously engaged within this award, and I think that one of the wonderful things about it is, while I love the Oscar, it's a patriarchal award, whereas this is a matriarchal award. It very much is, with all of the substance and nuance that the matriarchy brings, and that the patriarchy simply cannot.
Even people who've won multiple times, do you still see that stupor?
You do, you do. It's a religious, almost a religious experience. I remember when John Hamm finally, after 18 nominations, won. And he comes up to the stage, and instead of going up the steps, he just throws himself on the stage and kind of barrels around it. He gets up on his feet, and he comes over, and he's got this look on his face. Tina Fey has just given him the Emmy. He says, "This can't happen. This is impossible. This is impossible." And I think that it's a situation in which you have it's kind of a passage from one world to another. I gave the graduation speech this spring at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at my undergraduate alma mater, the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I said, when you walk across this stage and you are handed that diploma, I said, your life is going to change. I said, you are not going to be the same person walking down those steps as you walked up, because something is going to happen to you. And I said, this is something that happens whenever you have this kind of life-changing initiatory experience. J.G. Fraser in his Golden Bough, talking about ancient religions, and he's constantly talking about these initiation rites, in which boys would be put into like a bag. It would be like the womb, and then they would be drawn out, and then they would become new people as they went into the next stage of their life, into maturity and whatever. It was a kind of rebirth situation that ritually people would go through. And there's nothing more ritualistic than an Emmy Awards ceremony. A good friend of mine is the great Cambridge classicist Mary Beard, and years ago Mary wrote a book on the Roman triumph, and about how if you went out and you killed a bunch of people, then you would come back into Rome and you would drive them in front of you and all their booty and whatever. This is Pompey and Caesar, and a lot of these guys would do this, and you would go through the streets, and it would be a life-changing experience to such a degree that you would have somebody behind you who would whisper in your ear that this is all Maya, this is all illusion, this is not actually what's going on. They would paint the the person who was the triumphal leader would paint their face red in order to reflect the divinity of the sun, and somehow that they had moved into a different phase of their life. And then, of course, they would get up to where they had to go up the Capitoline Hill, and they got these great big old chariots, and the chariots wouldn't go through the two posts, and so they'd have to stop, get the horses off, take the chariot back, knock the wheels in a little bit, get it back up, then they'd get back in. And I said to Mary, I said, there are like 18 different things that you have noted in your book on the triumphs that you see at the Emmys. There's no way that this is necessarily going to go the way you hope it's going to go. Things can really get screwed up. There are going to be people who are not going to be very happy with you, and all kinds of things can happen. And so she came to the Emmys, and afterwards she said, oh yeah, this was definitely a 20th century version of a first century Roman triumph.
Well, with the gravitas that you attribute yourself to this award and the legacy that it has, when Emmy turned 50, what was done to celebrate her? What was done to celebrate and to play import on the awards?
I think the major thing is that we hired a producer to put together a reel of the first 50 years. And I think also that Emmy Publications hired a crew, a couple guys to come in to do a 50-year history of the Emmys. And of course our program book was filled with all kinds of references back to the first Emmys and big moments thereafter. So,
do you think as an organization it's been properly understood or archived, or that the legacy is institutionalized in a way that will be remembered?
No, I don't think that the archival consciousness of the Academy has reached that point of maturation. I think that with the foundation, which prior to its current leadership had been somewhat, kind of at the children's table, that budget-wise, etc., it was always, a good idea for lots of reasons. Financial reasons, contribution reasons was a good idea. But in terms of making it an academy that had a kind of intellectual substance, I think that when Dean Valentine came before the Board of Governors, these many years ago, and said, you guys really need to set up an archive. You need to do interviews, and you need to do exactly what we're doing here today. And I remember that meeting very well, that the board said, why didn't we think of this? And again, Rich Frank was a friend of Dean's over at Paramount, and I think that's how the whole thing got cooked up. And for the first time, we had an opening to the Academy as a place of very significant academic research. I think the things that you're doing with your interviews, the way you are indexing them. The New York Review of Books was a paper, and then it went online, and then just a couple years ago it finally indexed on a word-by-word basis that you could access. So if you want to look up Joe McCarthy, you could look up Joe and the 50 articles that had him in. And I know that you're doing the same thing. And so for the first time, and it's still something of an outlier, the Academy's foundation is addressing the academic side. That this is just an astonishing resource, and especially since with Dean's help, it had the foresight of beginning way back when and still being able to pick up, because it came at a time that you could still reach back into the earliest days of television and find people. Those days are diminishing as time moves on, but there are new things coming in, and you keep. But it came at a time where you could still get back in there. You could still get the editor from I Love Lucy. You could still get
Elma Farnsworth.
Yeah, that's right. And people that had the Academy not done this, I think that it would legitimately have been a significant failure in terms of one of its most lasting and significant contributions to the culture of television.
What is it you think we can learn from the stories of the founders and those who came before?
I think that there is a situation in which you can never count on things to remain the same. There were any number of times during the course of my career at the Academy where it wasn't necessarily a sure thing that this was going to keep going, that it was going to ever increase in terms of prestige and importance. I remember that there were George Schlatter cooked up something called the American Comedy Awards. The people at the Paley Institute were, attempting to do some things that were parallel to and possibly in competition with the Emmy Awards. The Academy and the Emmy were never a sure thing, especially after the very wobbly beginning that we had with this Academy after the split.
Right.
It was a very fraught time. There wasn't a lot of money. There wasn't the kind of respect and dignity shown to whole sections of the industry and the Academy. Having somebody like me produce the Creative Arts Awards, come on. We got it done, but we didn't get it done in the way it should be done. As Spike said, here's your salad and here's your Emmy. That's not the way to do this. You don't treat the goddess that way. You don't you don't show a kind of deep and lasting understanding of the industry that you're working in and the kind of importance that you're doling out. We can be cynical about the fact that the Emmy is part of a marketing device and whatever, but she's a lot more than that. She really is. And when you see the expressions on people's faces when they come off the stage with either the first or their 10th Emmy, and you recognize that they have been hit like Saul on the road to Damascus with something happening, and you go down Saul, but you get up St. Paul. And it's a different world that you're living in after that. You've been initiated into something else. You're always going to be noted in the press, Emmy winning or Oscar winning or Peabody winning or something like that. That simply becomes a tagline for you. But something else has happened, I think, inside of you. Your commitment to excellence, your whole attitude toward your self-worth. There was a hysterically funny acceptance speech. John, he was the second banana on 2.5 Men.
Fryer.
John, yeah. And he comes up on stage. He's won an Emmy supporting comedy. He says, I always thought that, these awards were sort of a reference to a passing popularity. He said, but now, he said, I've come to understand that this is a true recognition of one's real self-worth. It's very, very funny the way he put it. But he was only half joking.
Yeah.
I really believe that he was only half joking in that respect. It's not something that in our secular imagination we pause to think about or look at, but I think that in our deepest sympathies with the spirituality of the world that we live in, the yin and the yang, of the material and the spiritual, of the commercial and of the purely personal, I don't think that we have much opportunity to relate to that unless you're of a particular state of mind, which I am not. And I think that this is an opportunity to really engage in a kind of a Jungian depth field, a kind of larger synchronicity of where you are in the world and where you are in your industry and where you are, in your family. That when there's when that has happened to you, and it would be fun for you to go through your archives and you're talking to Emmy people. I bet you could find one after another remark, offhanded or not, and perhaps more in depth, that people are talking about how this is a real game changer. This is a life changer. This is something that happened to me. This is like being struck by some kind of spiritual lightning. And that's the reason why I say how interesting it is that, in secular North Hollywood, there is a 20-foot high statue of a pagan goddess out in front, who is the, one of the commandments is that you should not be dealing in false images of gods. Well, there you have it.
Given everything that you've just said and the import and value of this award, what is your biggest wish for how it's presented on television, and how do you work with the producer, the network, to ensure that high quality and standard is maintained?
Well, I think part of the success of the show is to structure it in such a way that it comes across in kind of baby spoonfuls to the audience. And I think that one of the things that has really helped is the generic subcategories of the evening. Comedy. And here we go into drama, and here we go into long form or into variety or whatever, that you can kind of get people in a sort of mindset that it isn't, okay, we're going to give something here for lead actress in a comedy series, and now we're going to give directing in a variety series. That's kind of a dissonance that you set up, whereas you get the harmonies within the different genres that keep the audience attentive to the fact that here we are in, Adventureland, and here we are going over here into another land and something else. And it helps to subdivide for the audience the world of television into the different component parts. It's sort of like, well, what's on Thursday night? Oh, well, there's a voice, and they're going to do a song thing, and then after that there's a detective show and whatever. There's a kind of dissonance to that sort of looking at it, which we are able to extract and to rebottle in the different categories. I think that this is something that Don Mischer is very much responsible for, and
as the producer,
I think that he's been a wonderful producer in that respect. That he tries his best to let people know that there is some sort of order and coherence and some sort of through line to each one of the different acts or different genres that he is dealing with.
And is that now at this point tradition, or is that something you bring up at your meetings?
No, I think it's tradition now, especially when you have Don coming back. Now, it might be that you would have another producer who would want to do something else, but I think that they would do it at the peril of reintroducing a kind of varietal dissonance, which really, it's next. How does that make sense going from one thing to another? Whereas if you have genres and you kind of build within those genres, and the only thing that we do differently is we take out drama and comedy series, and we pop those in at the end as sort of like, with the fireworks display, you have the big climax, the big finale at the fireworks. That's sort of the big finale at our fireworks.
Do you have other input through the year working with the network and the producer on the content?
We have a show committee for the telecast, and we have a show committee also for the creative arts. And the producers get together with the committee members. Bob Bain for the creative arts will bring in his whole team of producers and writers, and we'll talk about this, that, and whatever. I'll give you an example of how that actually makes a difference. Years ago, before we had the internet, it was a situation in which the cut-down version of the creative arts, be it the one night or now the two nights, always had to include everything. So you had to have on your show basically just a march through the giving out of the awards. At a meeting a couple of years ago, somebody said, well, Aunt Tilly in Iowa really wants to see Bob get that award. Well, she can get it on the feed, on the internet feed. It's going to be there. The whole show is going to be there, and she can say, okay, here he is. Whereas the show that Bob puts together, he can concentrate on the great speeches. He can concentrate on, the great clips or whatever. He is no longer compelled to 100% cover all of the action, and he is able to put together an entertaining show. And I know that he's eternally grateful to the committee and the academy for giving him that amount of freedom and creative license to do something that really is meaningful.
What makes a good show producer?
Well, first of all, I think that they have to be astonishingly organized. You look at those scripts and how it's just so broken down one second after another after another. So they really need to know the field. They need to know where everything goes. That, I would say, is the logistical problem. So you can't have a field general who is not a good logistician. Secondly, they have to have a creative vision. This year, for example, that screen was a creative vision. I mean, you were sitting there in the audience, and if I were in the front row of the audience, it would be sort of like being in the front row of a big screen theater. It's like I can hardly see it, and it was a decision to overwhelm with the enormity of these images and the way they would move around and fly these images. I don't know how they did it technically, but it was a vision of kind of dominance, that this is what's going on in this room, and it's big, and we're putting it out there in a very aggressive sort of way, as opposed to subdividing the. I know that years ago we had a tribute to Laugh In, and they had a big thing with doors that would open, and Lily Tomlin would say something and whatever, and it was disjointed. It never had any kind of, they were looking for a gestalt, but they never had the two parts of the gestalt. All they had was just the smaller part of it. Whereas in this, you have the gestalt of simply the size of the screen, and then everything going on in the screen integrated in a way that gestalt should be integrated. So that's the vision. So you need to have a logician, and you also need to have somebody who has a good battle plan, good vision of how to run this stuff through. And then you have to be lucky. You have to be lucky to get the fabulous speeches that you got this year. Just one after, starting with Tony Shalhoub and going one after another after another. This business where you stand up, my agent, my manager, and it's sort of like, no, that's. Then you have a situation like we had this year with just one really, really good speech after another. And that's something you can't ever plan on. And you have to be a producer who makes good choices in terms of the presenters. The people who go out there need to be able to handle. You need writers who can do it for them. And you need to be structuring it in a way that your comedians, who are notorious for this, don't turn on you. That, you cannot trust comedians. They will sense blood in the water, and they will go in a particular direction, and it's deadly, and it's not the way you're wanting to do. We had a situation this year, which actually I didn't bother me one bit, but Jeff Goldblum at the Creative Arts was presenting for the documentary, and he gave a long introduction talking about documentaries and whatever, and I said to Bob Bain afterwards, I said, was that scripted? He said, no. He said he just went off. And he said, this was a big surprise to everybody, and it was really very. I said, I enjoyed it. He said, I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
That's the last time you'll see it. You probably cut it.
So, yeah, it's a whole, witch's brew of things.
Do you ever give any sort of prep to the nominees about what the speech can and can't include?
Yeah, I think that there is always an attempt to, a letter from the president or a letter from the producer or whatever, Look, we really are looking for heartfelt. We really are looking for you to take this opportunity to, not only thank the people that you need to thank, but do it in a way that really is meaningful to the audience, that this is part of the show and it's a performance. You're on a TV show, and we want you to say what you need to say, but we want you to say it in such a way that there's a connection out there. It used to be, I was in the audience for the Creative Arts, and they didn't do it this year, but it used to be that the producer would come out and would urge people. That stage of the game is probably too late, because you got the list of people that you're going to thank and your whatever, and they would say, Don't worry about the laundry list. Do what you need to do to accept this award properly, to reflect on who you are and what this means to you, and then go to the camera afterwards. Go to the thank you cam. Thank you cam is like the pressure relief valve for the Emmy acceptances, because if they know they have an opportunity to thank Aunt Tilly, and they're not going to get the fruitcake at Christmas if Aunt Tilly doesn't get the thanks, they can do on stage something else.
Yeah. Just going back to some of the moments, Sally Field's speech in 2007, she was censored. It was a political speech, memorable, but do you have any input with the network of how they handle?
No, because at the
censorship?
rehearsal, they really wouldn't go into that. People, they come through, here's the blocking, and this is how you're going to get the envelope, and all of that goes on. But, it's just beyond the pale of the production, beyond the pale of the Academy when you get into that. Richard Gere would talk about his, affinity for the Buddhist religion and the people who were being harassed in, the mountainous areas of Western China and this, that, and whatever. Marlon Brando would send the Native American woman, or maybe she was, or maybe she wasn't, and then a speech would be given. I think that that's rather cynical on the part of people who basically, kind of dry gulch the intent of this and to use it. There's plenty of, take an ad out in Variety if you want to do something like that. I love the fact that FX was so impressed by two of their acceptors that they ran full-page ads in the LA Times calendar section a few days after, and they gave the entire speech. And the speeches were absolutely beautiful. It was just wonderful. It was even better than I remember seeing it. And so I think that there is an input from the production company or from the network or whatever, from the producers, from everybody, that don't use this in a kind of transactional way, because this has nothing to do with transactions. This has to do with speaking straight from the heart.
And there have been certainly plenty of milestones at the Emmys. I remember being at the 2015 Emmys when Viola Davis won. She was the first African American woman to win for lead actress. What do you recall about that in that year?
I recall that extraordinary dress she was wearing. Just absolutely, it was like she had come down from heaven. It was just extraordinary. And of course, her meaningful and very thoughtful and poignant remarks. She understood exactly where she was in the universe at that particular moment, and she was at the center of the Emmy universe. And she, like any great performer, completely got it and completely seized the moment and did a splendid job. It was a wonderfully memorable moment. And other times you'll have memorable moments which are, very diminutive. I remember, I think that it was Lee Grant years and years ago. She came up to receive an Emmy. Applause, 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 waiting for the applause. And then finally, when it ended, she said, "And the feeling is mutual." And she walked off, which I thought was just beautiful. Yeah, very elegant.
Have you had, Oscars got into some trouble several years ago with the Oscars So White campaign. How has the Academy dealt with inclusivity and with, dealing with including more voices and more diversity in the program?
Yeah, that's probably a different department from the awards department, but I know that there's an ongoing sensitivity to the whole matters of diversity and inclusivity. I think that the television industry was quite a bit more diverse than the motion picture industry was, and so the kind of criticism that particular organization with that particular structure had. That was a very oligarchic, paternalistic structure in that particular organization, which I think dates from the absolute intent of the organization, which back in 1927 or whenever they had 1929 their first Emmy or first Oscars, that it was kind of a union busting sort of deal. That it was, you know, Louis B. Mayer and the Moguls, and they were using it for reasons other than perhaps we're thinking of nowadays. And so that was kind of baked into the whole sort of paternalistic, oligarchic. The Academy was always much more of a democratic, sort of inclusive kind of situation, which I think is just, you know, the very nature of television production. Not that television production historically has not been, you know, woefully inadequate when it came to, you know, extending the rights and privileges of creative people to all creative people.
Mm. Do you need to take a break?
No,
You
I'm
wanna
fine.
keep it? Okay, you're good still? Camera's
We'll
good?
take a media break real quick.
Oh, media break. Okay, we'll take a media break.